Okay guys, thought it's time to make another video. So we've talked a lot about pressure balancing and hysteresis, and now I just want to tie that into peak velocity of the suspension and acceleration, which is something that people don't discuss very often. Um, so what we know is a bump, or an event as I like to call it, creates a kinetic energy and not a given velocity. I know there's a lot of people out there, they think you hit a certain type of object and you're going to create a certain type of speed, but that's not the case. This energy varies based on the type of event, shape of the bump, and the vehicle speed, and more importantly, the impulse of the inelastic collision. The faster you hit the same bump, the more kinetic energy you produce. So this goes without saying, the faster a rider is, and the faster he's going to hit objects, and the more energy he's going to produce when he does that. So that's something you need to consider. The event is considered an inelastic collision because kinetic energy is not conserved due to the action of internal friction. So what we need to keep in mind is our damper converts kinetic energy into heat via the action of fluid friction created by oil being forced through the various orifices. So this just means via the means of fluid friction, a damper dissipates kinetic energy by converting it into heat. The energy lost during the compression stroke is made up of the energy stored in the compressed spring and the energy lost through the dampening to the point of peak displacement. The spring's stored energy is dissipated during the rebound stroke. Your damping profile indicates how you dissipate the energy throughout the compression stroke. So we're just going to, so here we say, when a force is applied over a certain distance, that force does work. Work is just energy change. So here I've got listed a couple of different events. So we can see here a jump. We've got the 100mm block at 45 kilometers an hour and just a shed bounce. And you can see here the jump, the frequency is 3.2 hertz. We had 519 mil of total displacement for a full cycle. And we had a peak velocity of 5.2 meters per second, peak acceleration of 106.3 meters per second squared. Now you can see the block, it's a far higher frequency, much lower displacement. Peak velocity is 4.6 meters per second, and peak acceleration much faster at 261.43 meters per second squared. And then I just, out of curiosity, I did a shed bounce, so we get 2.2 hertz there, 131 mil of displacement, peak velocity of 0.9 meters per second, and a peak acceleration of only 12.56. So now it's going to, there'll be some graphs that just pop up on the screen. They include a few more events. You can see there we've added a few different ones, braking bumps and just random high frequency events from track testing using the telemetry. But you can see all the events are different in terms of displacement, in terms of velocity, where peak occurs, and the acceleration rate. So that's something that we really need to keep in mind. Okay, so peak velocity and acceleration. So peak velocity for each event is different based on the impulse of the event and, more importantly, the damper tune. Your damper must accelerate to its peak velocity over a given time and displacement. What's really crucial with this is velocity, or peak velocity, is not instantaneous. Because of the damping coefficient is directly proportional to the velocity, peak velocity will always be at the time and position of peak force. It just means that when your damper is moving at its fastest is when it produces its most force. So that's something you need to really think about and sort of work out how that all fits in together. So I'll just read it again because it's kind of one of the most crucial parts really. Peak velocity will always be the time and position of peak force, because that's just how your damper works, right? So the faster it moves, the more force it produces. So acceleration is the change in velocity divided by the change in time. Ironically, this means if you desire a damper that accelerates faster, you need a damper that produces force faster, or builds force faster. So that's crazy. That's like counterintuitive. Like a lot of guys are out there and they're like, oh, I want my forks to move quicker, or I want my shock to move quicker on the small stuff or the square edge stuff. And they just keep removing damping from their damper to try and make it move quicker. and all they inevitably end up doing is pushing the peak velocity further out. So you'll still inevitably produce the same sort of peak force. You'll just do it at a higher velocity and later in the stroke. So we can see this is exactly why a poorly balanced damper displays high levels of hysteresis and high levels of dynamic stiffness on high frequency events. So we've already seen that, and Penske's already talked about it. A well-balanced damper will respond far quicker. So here we have a bit of a case in point. So going back to some telemetry data, this is the jump with the two forks that I've tested. So they were pretty much the same configuration. I just added 0.3mm float to one set of forks to purposely make it poorly pressure balanced. And this is the jump telemetry. So no float fork produced a peak velocity of 5.4 meters per second at 58.14 millimeters of displacement, and in about 22 milliseconds it produced that peak velocity. Now this is just from the telemetry data. The float fork, so like I said, it's the same fork, same base valve settings, spring rates are all the same, all volumes, etc. The only thing that was different was the backer on the mid valve and the fact that it had 0.3mm of float. So this produces a peak velocity of 9.05 meters per second on the same jump, so substantially faster. But it didn't do it until 101.03 millimeters of displacement, and it took 83 milliseconds to get there. So you can see all we did is we delayed the force build up, and we delayed the peak velocity, and we delayed the stroke or the displacement in which that happened, and we delayed the time in which that happened. So we can tie that in with our dyno data. So these forks were tested. The no float fork is 21 kg at 1 meter per second. The float fork is 13 kg at 1 meter per second. And so then you can plot them into a nice little graph here, and we can look at velocity and how each fork's traveling at different speeds throughout the displacement. And inevitably they both produce the same net force throughout the whole event, but just in a different manner. So that sort of just comes back to that whole thing about the longer you delay the force build up, the longer you'll delay peak velocity. Yeah, the further out you'll stretch the displacement. So something really important to keep in mind there. So this just comes down to that whole mid-valve thing. I know a lot of guys still like to tune with a lot of float, and they think the fork's going to move faster if they add this float. But all you're doing there is you're delaying the pressure drop, or basically the force build up across the mid-valve. That's why so many guys incorrectly term it the mid-speed valve, because if you start adding float, we can see from dyno results that you don't really produce any significant force across the mid-valve until about 350 to 500 millimeters per second of speed or velocity. So all you're doing is, like I said before, you're just delaying when that mid-valve kicks in. So this is just all tying back into the pressure balance. So these are things that you really need to think about, and people really need to think about that peak velocity, where it happens, and acceleration, and how that ties into basically our force build up. So acceleration and force, basically tying together. If you want a fork to accelerate quicker, you're going to want to build the force quicker. And there's a valid reason for that. That just comes back to, we still need to force the oil across the valve. So all we're doing is transferring the energy from the bump to the wheel, from the wheel to the suspension. So it's pretty straightforward stuff when you really stop and think about it and how it all works in together. So yeah, hopefully you find this helpful, and yeah, thanks guys. Cheers.